We're going to take these lug nuts off. I'm going to use a 22mm socket. And remove the wheel. And disconnect this sway bar link on the bottom. There's a nut on the back side here. Take an 18mm wrench, loosen up the nut. If the stud starts to spin, then what you can do is use a hex socket or a hex bit or a hex key and hold the stud, but it's not spinning at this time. Remove that nut and just slide it out. Just going to use a screw jack underneath this control arm to support it. Before I take this nut off, this goes to the strut or the shock assembly. Use a 24mm socket. Take this nut off. All right, so I'm going to leave the nut on the end of this, and I'm actually going to use a pickle fork. There is different types of tools you could use. Just pop this off. Now I can pull this nut off. Slide that out. I'm going to take a 21mm socket, remove this nut right here. All right, now I'm just going to remove this screw jack or pull jack, get it out of the way. Now I'm going to separate the ball joint right here. This lower control arm bolt needs to be removed. You need to remove the nut, but to get the bolt out, the steering rack's going to be in the way. So what we need to do is loosen up the two steering rack bolts, one up here and then one over here. Loosen those up and we should be able to get enough clearance to get that bolt out. All right, I'm just going to take a 18mm wrench and just try to get it on there. Loosen this up. These are going to be pretty tight, so if you have to put a bar on them, put a pipe on the wrench. And I'll do the same on this side. Loosen it up. All right, loosen that up. I don't actually have to take the bolt out. I can just let it sit there. So the steering rack moves a good amount, especially on this side. This side, it would be ideal if I could loosen that bolt a little bit more, but we're going to try to get the bolt out at this point. Before I take this bolt out, I am just going to use a felt tip pen and mark where the bolt is. You can mark it on the opposite side as well, just like this. Mark the nut. So mark the nut over here, and then I'll mark the nut on this side as well. That's just going to make the alignment closer than if you didn't do this. That way it's a little bit easier when you go to have the alignment done. It might not have to be adjusted as much. I'm going to use a 21mm wrench on the bolt side and a 21mm socket on the nut side, and loosen it up and remove it. To make this a little easier, you can just take a piece of wood and just slide it in there to have the rack stay up. All right, now I can tap this bolt out a little bit, but I don't want it to rip this boot. So what you can do is you can take some type of washer bottle or water bottle or even a gallon bottle and just cut the plastic and just stick it underneath here. As you push that bolt out, it's going to prevent the boot from ripping. Then I'll take a punch and a hammer and just tap it the rest of the way out. And just make sure it's not too tight up against the rack, which it looks good. All right, and slide the bolt out. Now I'll take the 21mm wrench, put it on the front bolt, and then 21mm socket, and loosen the nut up. All right, slide that bolt out. Now we just want to pry front shock out. Slide that out of position. Just be careful, watch your fingers. All right, with that out of there, we should be able to pry the control arm out. And there we go. That's out. You need to tip the control arm down, then you can slide the ball joint out up here, just like that. Take the control arm, slide the ball joint in to the knuckle. You have to set it at an angle. Then we can raise this up, slide the shock in, just get the bolt started, the nut started. Slide this out. Just take a rubber mallet or a dead blow. Just tap this in. Right, now we can take the bolt. I just put a little bit of anti-seize on it. Just take a pry bar, try to slide this out. If you need to, you can also use a screwdriver and just line it up. Right, now we can take a screwdriver and just line this side up as well. Put a little anti-seize on this bolt and slide it in. All right, that's good. Just push on the control arm to try to get it to line up with your marks when you took it apart, and then we can snug these up. So we want to leave these nuts and bolts a little bit loose so that we can raise up the control arm, because you want to get the control arm at ride height, normal ride height, because when you tighten these down, that'll prevent the bushings from wearing out prematurely. What they recommend is having this all together and then torquing this on the ground, but it's extremely hard to torque this on the ground. We're going to use a 21mm socket and a torque wrench to 100 foot-pounds, 100 foot-pounds. And I'll do the same on this one. Now we can lower the pole jack. Now we can push up on the knuckle and take the nut, install the nut on the lower ball joint. Take a 21mm socket, tighten this up, and as you can see, the stud is spinning. So we're going to use a 6mm hex socket and tighten it up while the hex socket holds the stud from spinning. I'll take a 21mm socket and a torque wrench, torque this to 30 foot-pounds. After you torque this nut, now we need to angle torque this. We're going to use an angle meter. Put the same socket on, angle this to 0. Then I'll put a breaker bar on here, and I'm going to add 120 degrees. Take a 24mm socket, tighten this nut up. I'm going to torque this nut to 66 foot-pounds. Line up the bottom link. If it's not in line with the hole in the lower control arm, you can just take a wrench and line it up in the right position. And slide it through. Take the nut, slide the nut on, tighten the nut down. Then torque this to 92 foot-pounds. All right, take a pry bar. You can take that piece of wood out. And let the steering rack drop. And we can tighten these bolts down. All right, now if you can fit a torque wrench on there, you want to torque these bolts to 44 foot-pounds and then an additional 80 degrees. So do the best you can with that. Install the wheel. Put the lug nuts on. I'm going to use a 22mm socket. I'm going to torque these lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds in a star pattern. That way the wheel gets tightened down evenly. Whenever you're doing a job like this, where you're replacing front end components, you're going to want to make sure you go to a alignment shop afterwards, have your vehicle aligned. That way you can prolong the life of your tires. And just go around again, and you're good to go.